out in Serbia, not many Americans were interested in joining a complex feud between the royal families of Europe, a feud that was turning into a horrible conflict with unprecedented battlefield slaughter. But for reasons of his own and against the wishes and feelings of most Americans, President Wilson decided our boys should fight and die over there. The U.S. government then issued heaps of creative pro-war propaganda. They also created this exceptional document. It's the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. It insisted that the U.S. had specific enemies against whom all-out war was required. Any American who disagreed and criticized government policy ran the risk of going to federal prison as a political prisoner. This would have been grossly unconstitutional, of course, except for one thing. The government actually suspended the constitutional rights of every citizen. Because of a state of emergency, it was said, the Constitution itself had to be suspended. 350,000 American casualties later, the war was over and the Constitution was reinstated as the supreme law of the land. But during the war, the structure of the federal government had been altered dramatically. The federal government had tasted all the tempting extravagance of absolute power, and bureaucratic power would never be the same. The temptation to abuse the Constitution came again in 1933, during the financial crisis known as the Great Depression. On March 3rd, bankers at the privately held Federal Reserve Bank put incredible pressure on President Hoover to declare another state of emergency. Hoover rejected the plan because of its serious unconstitutional language that would again suspend the rights of all Americans. But March 3rd was Hoover's last day in office. On March 4th, a new president moved the bankers' plan ahead immediately, and 5 days later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Bank Stabilization Act into law. Within this act was language borrowed from the old Trading with the Enemy Act, including a new state of emergency, which again identified specific enemies, all of whose activities and transactions were declared illegal unless made legal by the American government. But who could be listed as an enemy of the federal government in 1933? It was the American people, declared enemies of the very government they established, maintained, and trusted. Most Americans have no idea that this FDR ruling is still in effect. In fact, it was renewed by Democrat Jimmy Carter in 1977, making it completely legal for the federal government to continue to regulate every area of life, in complete opposition to constitutional protections and the Bill of Rights. In those documents, our founders were very clear about America's unique position in world history. They determined that America was to be the first nation in history to make liberty an unalienable right of the people. No longer would the government dispense liberties to the people at will. Instead, the people would dispense power to the government. Today, we have stumbled backwards into the old curse of tyranny. The American people are no longer the masters of our government. We have become its enemy, and it deals with us as it sees fit. Many Americans think our Constitution provides automatic protections of our freedoms. Not so. It is the people who must defend the liberties in the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Our founders were especially wary of domestic enemies and prayed that American citizens would always have the same distrust of any public official, even a favorite son, who betrayed his oath of office. That healthy distrust of government should have been very strong in America in 1933. The forces of tyranny were exploding worldwide. Germany, Russia, and Japan embraced the first great rule of tyrants, that the government dispenses only those liberties they want the people to enjoy. It was the rule of man, not the rule of law, but Americans seemed oblivious to lawless ambitions in the Roosevelt administration. First, Roosevelt ruled that the banks were not responsible to discharge their obligations to their customers. The Roosevelt administration then began to regulate the enemy public according to its whims, not according to the Constitution. As we look back at this sudden power grab, we can clearly see the barriers against tyranny our founders worked so hard to build into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Roosevelt's big government status attacked those barriers directly, and they started with the one James Madison called the most important, insurmountable barrier. It was firearms in the hands of citizens. Gun control became a top priority of Roosevelt, and he seemed determined to surmount the barrier of the Second Amendment, which states, well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In 1934, the government quickly laid a heavy tax on the ownership of certain military firearms, precisely those that would well arm a 1930s Second Amendment militia. Why was gun control such an important priority to the ambitious Roosevelt administration? James Madison told us about power grabs of this kind in 1785. The advantage of being armed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition. The governments of Europe are afraid to trust the people with arms. If they did, the people would certainly shake off the yoke of tyranny, as America did. Indeed, America's 18th century civilians could not have done it without military weapons in the hands of young and old. The idea that the militia was formed to protect America from foreign enemies is simply not historically true. The militia exists to resist any policeman or soldier who obeys a tyrant. When King George tried to steal the liberties of the people of Massachusetts, the militias found it necessary to use deadly force against the king's police. Until independence, British soldiers were the only equivalent of a domestic police. This is why George Washington called privately owned military firearms the liberty teeth of a free people. It was those firearms that eventually forced the world's most powerful tyrant to back off. Just a few months after the Bill of Rights was adopted, Congress went to yet greater lengths to establish the permanent militia in the United States. They enacted the Militia Act of 1792. That law required everyone covered by the act to have a military rifle and the ammunition for it. These military firearms were to be in people's homes, not in armories. Weren't the Americans who passed that law afraid of an armed populace? After all, George Mason noted that the militia is everyone but the politicians. No, they were not afraid. They were acting lawfully under the rule of law, not the rule of man. Besides, they held the view that a little fear is a healthy thing for politicians. Thomas Jefferson noted, when governments fear the people, there is liberty. When people fear the government, there is tyranny. Today, the American people have good reason to be fearful of a government that has, in essence, declared war on them and their freedoms. Every power-hungry tyrant shared one fear that was particularly worrisome: military firearms in the hands of their people. Patrick Henry believed anyone who threatened public liberty needed to be threatened with downright force. Whenever you give up that force, Henry warned, you are ruined. Our founders were experts on government tyrannies. They had studied despotic monarchies of Europe and had first-hand experience with the tyrannical and ambitious George III. Like all tyrants, King George feared the guns of his subjects. He ordered his generals in America to register all firearms, first in the cities, then in the countryside. Today's Americans should find it interesting that he did it way back then in the name of crime control. Shortly thereafter, the King's General Gage was ordered to confiscate not just those firearms, but powder and food supplies as well. When Gage tried it outside of Boston, he was met by a well-regulated militia that had elected their own commander. Gage opened fire on that militia. The Battle of Lexington is remembered as the shot heard around the world. The next day, the King's Governor of Virginia ordered the looting of the colonists' supply of gunpowder at the Williamsburg magazine. This part of Virginia was Patrick Henry's backyard, and the governor should not have been very surprised at Patrick Henry's outrage, since the Patriot orator only a month before had delivered his stirring call to arms at the Second Virginia Convention.
It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is a gentleman wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death.
Are these the words of outlaws, or of the men who wanted the rule of law? These were men who did not approve of government leaders seizing more power for themselves than had been agreed to in the colonial charters. When Patrick Henry realized that the British were confiscating arms and powder so that they could have unlimited power, he stirred the Hanover militia. They elected Henry their captain and rode to Williamsburg to recover their stolen gunpowder. So popular was Henry's action that by the time the militia reached Williamsburg, their ranks had swollen to 5,000 from the cheering crowds that lined their way. The powder was compensated twice over. The British governor, fearing for his safety, ended up on board a ship in the York River. Well regulated these militia were, but controlled or sanctioned by the established government, they were not. The actions of the colonists indicated that they viewed militia as something that free men had an unalienable right to organize among themselves. Were the formation of colonial militias the actions of revolutionaries? Revolutionaries are not concerned about the legitimacy of government. They appoint themselves and strike out using force. The American colonists had remonstrated for over a decade before the War for Independence regarding the kinds of liberties that were being taken away from them by the government over in England. It was an American-British government. It was all one government, and these were the rights of Englishmen that were at stake, the rights to worship, the rights to speech, the rights to be in their own homes. All of these rights were being strangled by a British government that viewed the people in America as increasingly their enemy. There had been a war that had ended in 1763 against the French and the Indians, but as far as the Americans could tell, the British government continued to treat them as an enemy. The British government in London was trying to tell the Americans who would be their religious leaders, who would be the heads of their churches. They were kidnapping men on the high seas. They were using writs of assistance to basically have untrammeled access to the homes of the Americans, breaking in, doing searches without any kinds of warrants. They were trashing the legal process and the rights to a jury trial, even hauling people over to England, all in the name of justice, but it was no justice, and increasingly the Americans were growing restive because they could see that in the hands of a tyrant like King George III, their liberties were being choked, and soon they would be no more if they did not take action. When hostilities broke out, it was between a legal government supported by the people and a foreign government that had become increasingly illegitimate. Most Americans, I think, have heard about all of the taxes that have been imposed without representation, and we've all heard about, I think, the Boston Tea Party. But really what was at issue was whether or not the Americans were going to be able to live with a self-government here in the United States. One time, long after the War for Independence had been fought and concluded, an interviewer asked a 90-year-old survivor of the Battle of Lexington, what was it that had led you to want to declare your independence and fight the way you did that morning in Lexington Green? Was it the tea tax? And the old man said, no, never drank the stuff. None of the other boys did. Well, he said, was it the stamp tax that had finally provided the flash that sparked that conflagration? And he said, I never saw any one of those stamp taxes myself, never paid them myself. Well, then what was it that drove you all to do what you did that morning? And he said, well, very simply, we had always governed ourselves, and we always intended to, and the British meant that we shouldn't. That's what that war was all about, the right to govern ourselves here in this new land. The new laws and regulations of today's U.S. government are so numerous that the people are more afraid of government agencies like the IRS than they are of our numerous street criminals. And still more unjust laws and swarms of officers bear down on us daily. Noah Webster wrote that before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every kingdom in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword because the whole body of the people are armed. The corollary of Webster's observation is that once the American people are disarmed, like the Europeans, the government can declare war on an enemy public without any fear of resistance. But as long as there is even one gun in the hand of a private citizen, the government must deal with resistance. Government force is a frightening thing when turned on its own citizens. Ordinary citizens in Texas and Idaho found out what it means to be part of the enemy public. When these targeted enemies resisted, government wrath was fatal. Were the Waco and Weaver family massacres a test of that resistance? One thing the government learned from those two operations is that not every American is apathetic about the newest government tyrannies. Many Americans were appalled at the unjust, illegal show of raw government hatred of its citizens. Law enforcement officials know well that the government's actions at Waco and in Idaho were tyrannical and follow a pattern of tyranny that could spread rapidly if not challenged. That challenge is growing from coast to coast. Many sheriffs in several states have such strong objections to the unconstitutional Brady Law, for example, that they are refusing to do the required background check. Eureka, Montana Sheriff Ray Nixon is one such patriot, and the people of the county love him. In support of Sheriff Nixon and out of concern for his safety, community leaders from Lincoln County gathered together one evening in February 1994 and offered to form themselves into a legal militia. So, under Title 10 of the U.S. Code and the Montana Posse Law, qualified citizens made themselves available to be deputized as members of the sheriff's posse. Those men were not a bunch of vigilantes or a mob. That evening, those Lincoln County patriots began reclaiming their Second Amendment rights. They began the process of forming a lawful force to resist any tyrannical act on the part of the federal government, especially any act that might try to force their sheriff to betray his oath of office and turn his proper authority over to a government with bad intentions. Other Americans are also rising up to reclaim their constitutional protections. They are reading their constitutions. They are exercising their First Amendment rights to criticize the government. They are reaffirming the 10th Amendment by rediscovering their powers possessed by every state.
5 state legislatures have raised the 10th Amendment like a battle flag.
For example, be it resolved by the House of Representatives of the 59th General Assembly of the State of Colorado, the Senate concurring herein, 1, that the State of Colorado hereby claims sovereignty under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States over all powers not otherwise enumerated and granted to the federal government by the United States Constitution. 2, that this serve as notice and demand to the federal government as our agent to cease and desist, effective immediately, mandates that are beyond the scope of its constitutionally delegated powers. Will the federal government respect this assertion of legal rights, or will they prove that they are the outlaws? Will they respect the presence and the power of legal local militias like that in Lincoln County, Montana? Or will the men of the militia have to do more than practice with their weapons? If the American government forces its will too far, as a government did in 1774, every American will be thankful for the 1994 militias in small towns across the U.S. Some Americans say tyranny will never happen in America, but our founders noted that tyranny was the rule, not the exception, through all of human history. Our founders warned that tyranny would always be possible, even in the great nation they spilled their blood to create. This is why they said people must always distrust their governments, no matter how small. American citizens dropped their guard in 1933, and the government has never returned to the people the powers they grabbed in the 1930s. Today, the federal government continues to grow in ways that are similar to the biggest socialist tyrannies of the 20th century. Will our government also follow the deadly pattern of other modern tyrannies, which installed policies of gun registration, gun confiscation, and then genocidal murder of an unpopular minority? That fearful trend has seemed to have the full weight of U.S. federal law behind it since 1968, when the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed. The language of this bill clearly did not come from the U.S. Constitution, but it took some brave scholars from Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership to trace the origins back to the 20th century's most remarkable tyranny. They discovered that the late Senator Dodd of Connecticut had served as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals. When Dodd returned to the States, he asked the Library of Congress to translate a copy of the Nazi Gun Control Act he had brought back with him. Shortly after the completion of the translation, Dodd introduced it as a bill in the United States Congress. When it passed a few weeks later as the Gun Control Act of 1968, it followed the Nazi legislation almost paragraph for paragraph. Dodd even borrowed a Hitlerian phrase for the title, the Safe Streets and Crime Control Act. Hitler succeeded in taking enough firearms from the people of Germany so that the streets became safe for the triumph of a socialist tyranny called Nazism. Today, our own government speaks about crime problems and coming dangers of civil unrest. Socialistic bureaucrats still suggest that the American public is an enemy that must be dealt with. In fact, some foreign tyrants suggest that law-abiding gun-owning Americans make up the last great enemy public in the world because they are almost the last civilians to be armed. The last civilians with the freedom to organize themselves into militias. In 1774, it was the small community militia that secured liberty for the greatest free nation in the history of the world. In 1994, it may be these same militias that stand between the end of American freedom and the beginning of the final world tyranny. The law-abiding American public really is the #1 enemy of world tyranny. Today, lawful militias are cropping up all over the U.S. This is why the federal government is growing nervous that the people may finally take back their Constitution and reduce the federal government to the role the Founding Fathers intended, to be servants, not masters of the people.
Inspection arms.
We have seen in our study of the militia that it is local and defensive in nature. The militia is not designed to go on the offensive. Our Founding Fathers understood and used the militias as something that those with an individual right to keep and bear arms could choose to do. Militias came from the individuals of a community, not from the government. The militias were supported by their communities, just as a legitimate government is supported by that same community. The challenge to freedom-loving Americans right now is first and foremost to take advantage of the freedoms we have to vote for our public officials as well as in juries. These are the first defenses of our liberties that cannot be ignored. Nor can we allow ourselves to become impatient with the elective process while there is any chance at all to restore the Constitution in this way. The courts have begun to show a renewed interest in the 10th Amendment, which prohibits the Congress from doing anything that is not specifically permitted to it in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The Brady Law has seen reversals in several federal courts on the grounds that Congress had no authority to mandate a background check on state and local governments. Other federal courts have reversed the ban on guns in schools and the 1986 machine gun ban enacted by Congress on the grounds that Congress does not have that authority. Congress had claimed that authority under the Commerce Clause, but some federal courts have rejected that stretching of the Commerce Clause. It is interesting to consider that to ban alcohol in the 1920s, it was thought necessary to amend the Constitution in order to enact prohibition. But after the Roosevelt Revolution, the Commerce Clause was stretched to justify federal government involvement in everything, using the theory that everything enters commerce. The courts may well be moving back to the original intent of the Commerce Clause, which was designed simply to prevent states from restricting commerce from other states. If this trend continues, Congress will no longer be able to claim authority to regulate and ban guns. While the militias are an important and constitutionally protected freedom that individual Americans enjoy, so is voting and participation in juries. We must be sure to use all of our rights in the defense of our freedom.